eternity passed on that plane ride while her heart simultaneously beat at light-year speed. The months spent in Los Santos had far more of an effect on her life than they ever should have. Curled up in her seat, hugging her knees tightly to her chest, she gazed out the window with a blank stare. The blank stare matched the void she felt being that far away from not only Leo, but the few people who she felt she could call her friends. It was the hardest decision she ever had to make. Before long, the plane was descending, tires sliding and bouncing against the concrete of the runway. Orange flags waved the jet into its home for the next hour or so, the captain parking it with ease. That was the moment the regret hit her. Like a zipper, people began filling the aisle and walking down and out, onto the ramp and down into the airport. The girl who felt she could never cry felt a constant streamline of tears that were shaken with every step. One hand covered her mouth and did its best to hide her face. All she had done since she had been alone was cry, despite putting on a brave face for her friends and Leo. A sniffle elicited by the salty rivers was the only sound that came from her. Others around her had no idea why or how someone could cry that way and not make a noise, but their stares weren't even noticed. The last step from the ramp to the airport was all she needed to know about the mistake she made. The familiar sounds, the welcoming sense of the stand selling sweets, and the announcer over the radio system not only welcoming people back to Oregon, but welcoming the visitors to the state were not the only things waiting for her. A man dressed in black spotted her nearly immediately, pressing a call button on his walkie-talkie while never letting her leave his sight. Dark eyes followed her moves, and their eyes met for just a moment before she looked away. The hood of the outfit Kara had bought her was quickly tugged down, hiding her face from the man as well as the tears she was so embarrassed of. Robert Lakin was his name. She'd grown up around him as he was her father's right-hand man and security detail. Everywhere he had traveled to share the technology he had discovered through the experiments he placed on his daughter, Robert was there to make sure no one would interfere. Standing over 6 foot tall, his presence alone was intimidating to Nova, who barely stood at 5'4". His stature was large, broad shoulders holding his air of threat high and tall. Nova tried her best to scurry away, simultaneously trying to call Leo. A rush of horror and panic made her cheeks almost feel numb. When she finally got his contact up and went to press call, a hand grabbed her wrist and the phone dropped. A quiet gasp sucked in while she bent down and grabbed it. Knowing full well she couldn't fight someone like Robert alone. She didn't even have her knife on her. Robert guided her with fingertips digging into her arm, leaving bruises without a care. Finally, Dr. Henry Johnson had his prized possession back. The thing that had made him one of the most sought-after scientists through many military channels, all in hopes of making super soldiers. The walk through the airport was brisk. Nova stumbled a few times as she tried to keep up, thankful that Robert hadn't seen her slip her phone into her shirt while they were walking. Possessions were few and far between, but she had the picture of her and Leo and her phone, and that was all that mattered. That was enough. At the blacked-out SUV, Robert shoved her in quickly and got her into the passenger side. Nathaniel, another close friend of her father's, driving. The drive was silent with eyes on her the whole time. No move could have been made to get help, and she knew even if she got some, she'd put a target on Leo's back or anyone else who tried to help. With nothing else to do, she stared out of the window at the passing trees and mountains while tears flowed heavily from her cheeks like a waterfall eager to meet rushing rapids. Upon arrival at the Rogue Laboratory, her father met the vehicle outside in a joyous disbelief. The smile on his face only growing as she was taken out of the car and escorted to him, a hand gripping her hard on each arm, one from each man.
Nova, Nova, Nova.
A heavy sigh chasing his chant of disappointment.
It's a shame you've become so damn delinquent, you know that? I've heard of AI becoming sentient, but...
A hand meeting her chin to push it up.
I thought Are you?
The tears were still falling and they stopped him in his tracks.
You're crying!
Shock planting itself both on his face and in his tone. The hand gripping her chin pressed harder, turning her face side to side while she refused to look at him.
How on earth did it learn to cry?
He scoffed, but the smile on his face spoke of something more sinister.
Speak.
The command barked out, not knowing she was unable to speak while crying. Silence hung in the air while his eyes traced over her face, taking in every detail of it. When he was done, he pushed her face to the side and looked at Robert.
Chain her up in her quarters. See to it that some food is brought to her. Make sure there are no weapons on her. I have to go to my office and think. I'll upload her data and figure out what's going on in the morning.
With nothing more than a grunt, Robert moved and Nathaniel quickly followed, leading her into the laboratory and through a series of hallways and doors before she was returned to the pitiful concrete box of a room she had had. Color was void. The hearts she loved, the pinks and purples she tried to wear, and the essence of her was null in the room. Gray surrounded it all with chains to the bed as well as a long one that seemed to only have one cuff. Different situations and reactions had called for different restraints in the past. An ankle cuff was put on before she was pushed onto the bed. The old metal springs squeaked under her small frame, body bouncing just slightly. Prison would have been a nicer place to be than here.
We'll be back in a moment.
Robert spoke without any emotion, leaving right after. A mistake on his part. Never did it cross his mind that she had much of anything on her. A carry-on wasn't even there, let alone a suitcase. What could she possibly have on her? As soon as Nova knew she was alone, she rushed to hide her phone and the picture of her and Leo. A small brick near the head of her bed had come loose years ago, but slid in perfectly. As soon as she found it, she pulled it out and hid her most valuable possessions. After 20 minutes, food was brought, placed on the floor next to her bed. A quick search was done, and once they found nothing, she was free to eat, ending the night for her only an hour later after chaining her up by both her hands and her legs. Sleep clearly didn't come easy, and all she wanted was cuddles from Leo. Memories of their hotel, the way they'd cuddle and fall asleep every night for months, made sleep even more impossible with how cold the room was, both literally and figuratively. The next morning was the start of the nightmares. Tests were run, experiments were had, and Nova was fearful before anything terrible had even happened. Dr. Johnson, to see her cry the first night of her arrival, it had sparked such intrigue. Was she becoming human? Was humanity even capable for such a being? All these questions would have been met with a solid no until she had come back. How could he unlock this? How could he turn back the bad emotions and make sure only ones that were wanted stayed? There were too many questions. Any scientist would confirm. Questions lead to experiments. To figure everything out, he downloaded her consciousness and ran it through a program he had worked on for years and was still actively working on. It hadn't been perfected by any means, but it was a way to dig through a person's most private thing, their thoughts. After about an hour of running through the data, he had names like Leo, Kara, Debo, Veronica, and even more showed up. And all this did was lead to more questions.
Who are they, Nova?
Dr. Johnson circled her as she laid with her back elevated on a table, bound by both her wrists and ankles. "Who are you talking about, Father?" a quiet voice asked.
Leo.
One name at a time, heart monitor and nodes from an EEG taking in more data and information. Immediately her heart sank. Tears welled up in her eyes while a lump of nausea formed in her throat like a hard ball. It was formed from disappointment in herself and a longing for him and the safety he always tried to give her. The mistake of coming slapping her in the face. "My boyfriend." As soon as the words left, tears started to slide down her cheeks, immediately making her father smirk.
Your boyfriend, And do you love him?
A brow rose. "Yes." The word leaving her in a breathless whisper as if she had been punched in the gut.
A machine. Love? And do you think he loves you too?
Instead of answering, she just nodded, looking away while squeezing her eyes shut. Talking while crying was not something she was capable of.
Interesting indeed. What is his last name?
The doctor growing concerned that he may actually be some sort of scientist himself. Nova was incapable of being loved on any emotional level, so there had to be some explanation as to why and how someone led her to believe the impossible. Silence hung in the room, shaking her head a little. All this did was anger her father more, but words were impossible to form when she cried.
Speak.
A quick slap in the face did nothing to warrant any words, but it did feed the hunger of his growing irritation. An hour passed of what could be considered torture, though he realized halfway through that the tears were not connected to physical pain. Instead, it was all emotional. Bringing up friends and Leo always caused tears and always pushed a lockup of her brain. The connection between being able to speak and cry, clearly unabridged. That night, she went to call Leo. It had only been a day, but she wanted to hear his voice. The only thing that made her feel okay, that calmed her down, was knowing that he was out there somewhere. Like she had done the night before, she would just call a few times to listen to his voice and hang up. As she had pulled out her phone from her hiding spot, she hadn't noticed the cameras in her room live, signaling that someone was in fact actively watching. Right as she was about to press send, her phone shattered to the ground. The damage was so extensive she couldn't even turn on the screen. The last bit of comfort she could find was gone. Over the next few days, he developed a plan, since she was now clearly faulted with the ability to cry, but he wanted to keep up everything else he had to erase memories of her friends and Leo. Never even contemplating segmented memory erasure until this point, he was nearly at a loss for words. Tons of studying and research led him to experiments. These experiments, however, could only be performed on Nova herself. After uploading her full consciousness to the mainframe computer of his laboratory, he got to work. Nodes placed, programs running, and of course no sedative. The procedure to nitpick everything without detaching other traits went heavy. 3 hours later, and he started to ask questions to test everything.
Nova Johnson. Who is Veronica?
Veronica. She's my sister. The answer given softly but met with a slight electrical shock from a probe.
Who is Depot?
The owner of Senior Another shock.
Who is Nacho?
I don't know. I thought nachos were a type of food, not person. A smile immediately pressed on her father's face. Clearly, it worked. Just not completely. After 20 minutes of questioning, he called it a day. Time passed as he tried his best to tweak the procedure. After a week or so, he did it again. Another 5 hours later, with a much more direct and stronger zap to her brain. There was no way this wouldn't show much difference in who she was and what she could do.
Nova. Who is Eli?
The room silent, breathing almost stopped in anticipation of the answer. Her mind raced for the answer, and when she finally found it, there was a panic in her blood. Why did it take her so long? A friend. The head of her group. A slow blink going his way, though her heart monitor showed how elevated her anxiety was.
I see.
It angered him that he couldn't figure out how to do this. According to his data, it should have been done. No recollection should exist, but it did.
And Leo.
I love him. No hesitation in her answer. He's my boyfriend.
Enough! How are you remembering?
The words spat out with hate. Eyes narrowed, focusing what was once his daughter in an evil gaze.
You are not a person. You are not a human. Whatever sentience with emotion you have is to cease to exist. Do you understand?
Yes, but I don't know how.
Do not.
The sentence ended abruptly with a slap to her face as hard as he could muster. Thankfully, Nova didn't feel pain, but the hate was felt.
You will forget. I'll erase and give you a whole new goddamn chip if I have to. Do you understand me?
Spittle flung from his lips to her face. Fear filled her eyes as she saw the enormous amount of hate growing and spewing from his body. Yes, sir.
Yes.
A nod going his way, holding her breath until she felt his hand finally release her face.
Good.
And with that, he stomped off, leaving her there chained up. A day passed before Nathaniel finally came on orders from Dr. Johnson to grab her. Food hadn't even been eaten in over a day, and she was on the verge of passing out. Something about seeing her there with bruises, empty, and somehow processing everything tugged at his heartstrings.
Come on, Miss Nova. Let's get you some dinner.
His words spoken softly as he helped her to her feet. The rest of the night went by as usual. Dinner placed on a plate on the floor of her room while she stayed chained to the wall with the long tether. Fast asleep shortly after she ate, she slept soundly, curled up in the tiniest ball she could possibly muster. A shake of her body came from a large hand around 3 a.m. A groan escaped her while her eyes slowly opened and focused on the man in front of her.
Shh.
Nathaniel had come to release her. It most likely would cost him his life, but he couldn't live with himself anyways if he watched someone deteriorate like her. Humanity had found her but was fleeting quickly.
Come on, Nova. I know you're probably scared. I want you to go back. Go find your friends. Go make a family. Now.
And then he moved quickly to unlock her ankle. In a hurried motion, she grabbed her broken phone and picture of her and Leo before shoving it into her pouch that Kara had gotten her. Freedom was coming, and the regret would hopefully dissipate. The two snuck out of the house, Nathaniel knowing the blind spots of all the cameras. By the time that they got to the airport, the alert that she was gone was too late. Left at security, she made it through by 7 a.m. and was on a plane, heading back to Los Santos. Hopefully, she'd be able to find some peace and happiness once again.